Is this really the right time to trade Jeff McNeil? I'm going to discuss that on today's episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, it might seem like I didn't take a big break, but this is the first podcast I've recorded in over a week. I actually did a bunch of podcasts before I went on a Christmas vacation, so it's good to be back. Happy New Year's to all you Locked On Mets listeners. First episode of 2022, and what we're discussing today is a report that came out last Thursday by Pat Ragazzo of Sports Illustrated, and Pat, of course, has been on this show a bunch. And what Pat was reporting is that Jeff McNeil is on the trade block. As soon as the lockout ends, the Mets could look to deal McNeil for pitching help. In the first segment, I'm going to go through that report. Why would the Mets look to trade Jeff McNeil now? In the second segment, I'm going to detail why I believe the Mets should absolutely hang on to Jeff McNeil, because I think he's more valuable to their team on the roster than on the trade block. And then in the last segment, I will detail the one circumstance where I would be okay with a Jeff McNeil trade, and that would be if there is another big signing in the pipeline for someone like a Kris Bryant or a Trevor Story. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So let's go through this report. Pat Ragazzo on Thursday said that multiple sources indicated to him that the Mets intend on making Jeff McNeil available on the trading block with their sights set on acquiring pitching help. Pat goes on to explain that there is still some contention among those on the roster with Jeff McNeil. We all know about Raccoon Gate from last year, how Jeff McNeil and Francisco Lindor got into it, where Jeff McNeil was kind of brushing off the defensive shifting the Mets were doing, and basically telling Lindor that he had it. He didn't need his guidance in the infield when the two of them were getting crossed up multiple times out there, and that led to that altercation in the dugout where Francisco Lindor later to the media tried to brush it off, saying the Mets are saying that McNeil and him were arguing about whether it was a rat or raccoon. Ridiculous story. You go through this season, Jeff McNeil never quite seemed comfortable this last year. So that tension, if that really does exist in the locker room, you could understand why the Mets might look to trade Jeff McNeil. And because he still has widespread interest, as Pat points out in his article for Sports Illustrated, which again, you should check out. I'll leave a link to that in the description of the podcast episode so you can read that yourself. But he talks about the fact that there has been a lot of interest in Jeff McNeil. And if you look, of course, over the first 3 years of his career, when Jeff McNeil was an all-star in 2019 and finished, I believe, in the top 6, if I'm not mistaken, in the Rookie of the Year voting in 2018, he was a great player, a 319 hitter, a 383 on base percentage, 501 slugging, 884 OPS. If you go to that 2019 season, Jeff McNeil put up a 143 WRC plus, which is weighted runs created plus, measuring hitters based on a league average of 100. So in 2019, Jeff McNeil was 43% better than your league average hitter. That is the exact same WRC plus that Pete Alonso put up when he hit 53 home runs that season. That shows you the incredible value Jeff McNeil can have when everything is right. He brings great versatility, can play a good second place, can play a good third base. He's good in the corners and the outfield. I know there's some Mets fans that somehow developed this perception, maybe because of that article when it came to him and Lindor getting crossed up, that McNeil's a bad defensive player. But all the metrics tell us that he's a very good defensive player. He brings plus versatility as opposed to a player like Kris Bryant, who can play all over the place, but the metrics tell us he's not good in all these positions he plays. Jeff McNeil actually brings positive defensive versatility. He's going to hit for a high average when he's right. And he's coming off a really bad year where he hit 251, only got on base at a 319 clip. That's not who Jeff McNeil is. So Right now, the Mets have an opportunity to trade Jeff McNeil based on his first 3 seasons, where other teams might be looking at that down year as, just an aberration. But I also believe it's an aberration. I don't think Jeff McNeil is a 251 hitter. I think if you look at what he did throughout his minor league career and then his first 3 years in the big leagues, it's very repeatable what he was able to do. He has elite bat to ball skills. I've done previous episodes where I talked about how, Jeff McNeil's season was a little bit of bad luck. He wasn't quite driving the baseball the same way, but his plate discipline didn't change. They tried to reform his swing a little bit this past year, and it didn't quite work out. He had to deal with 2 different pitching coaches. He dealt with a hamstring injury. Just a bad season all around for Jeff McNeil. But I don't think that this is a player that is suddenly a pumpkin, suddenly someone that has become a just slap hitter that can't find holes anymore, that doesn't have enough to his game to adjust. I think Jeff McNeil is going to be a good player moving forward. And the question is, can he still be that with the Mets? Can he mend fences? Is there still room to keep him around? Does he want to be here? Because I guess that's another thing. Maybe Jeff McNeil doesn't want to be with the Mets. And if that's the case, of course you should be looking to move him. But I do think if the Mets trade Jeff McNeil, this is going to be your next Justin Turner, Daniel Murphy, the next player that gets moved to another team. And hopefully the Mets at least get a good return for him as opposed to Murphy, where they just got a qualifying offer, and Turner, where they just cut him. Maybe this is an instance where the Mets can get some value in return for the player. But I believe he'll go somewhere else, and I think he'll be an all-star again. I wouldn't be surprised if he won a batting title. So you have to take that into account. And the question then becomes, what happens to that spot on the roster when it comes to your lineup? Who's starting at second base? You're just going to roll out Eduardo Escobar and Robinson Cano every day? Is that the move? Are you going to make another signing? Are you going to try to trade for another infielder to come in? Are you so confident in a Mark Vientos that you think he's going to be your third baseman at some point in the early parts of the season, and you just want Escobar to be your second baseman? Eduardo Escobar, in his introductory press conference, said he's more comfortable at third base than at second, but he'll play anywhere. There's a lot of elements that come into play if the Mets decide to trade Jeff McNeil. The other question is, what's the cost to acquire a top flight starting pitcher? Jeff McNeil alone, does that get you Luis Castillo? I don't think so. I'm just not sure if this is the best move for the Mets in 2022, and that's what I'm going to explore more in just a minute. It's the new year, so that means New Year's resolutions, and if yours is about getting fit or eating healthier, make sure you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, maybe even better than a candy bar, and it'll help you stick to your resolution because it tastes so good, so you'll want to eat it. And unlike other protein bars, which can be chalky or waxy or taste like a chemical spill, this is a healthy treat that you're going to be happy to go to. And it just doesn't get boring because there's so many different flavors you can choose from. So you know what? If you get tired of eating that raspberry Built Bar, you got a cookies and cream, you got the coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, so many delicious flavors to choose from. And they're all covered in 100% chocolate. So you're going to get that sweet fix you're looking for if you're on a diet. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. And it is clear why Built Bar is the snack you should be looking towards if you're trying to keep those New Year's resolutions. So if you want to try Built Bar today, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So throughout this offseason, I've pitched a lot of different trade ideas, and we're in hot stove times, even though the stove is ice cold as they unplugged it and set it all on ice as we are in this lockout. But while we've gone through these different podcasts and we've gone through all these different iterations of discussing the Mets roster, we know what they need at this point, right? They probably need at least one more starting pitcher to add to that rotation. They got to flesh out their bullpen more. And there is still this push to maybe add a bigger bat in the middle of that lineup. Right now, if you look at the power source for the New York Mets, it's Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, and not a ton else when it comes to pure power guys. Eduardo Escobar also deserves that type of a classification, but you're looking at a lot of high on base guys, and Jeff McNeil factors into that equation, but maybe it would make more sense to have a Kris Bryant, right? That would be the idea here, right? If you traded Jeff McNeil, maybe you're going to make that type of a signing, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the next segment. That's the only way a Jeff McNeil trade would make sense to me, is if you are already planning on making that next big signing. But let's just talk about what the Mets have done this offseason. Have they made a trade yet? No. No, it's all been free agency. That was the plan, right? Sign free agents to short-term, big money deals at times, fill out that roster with players like Max Scherzer, Mark Canha, Starling Marte, Eduardo Escobar that can help you win now, but are not going to hamstring you into the future. Jeff McNeil is a cost-controlled asset. He's cheap. He's under control for 3 more seasons. He's just hitting arbitration. He is not going to cost you a ton. He's a functional piece on this roster that really helps you get through a 162-game season. Because let's just say spring training, Brandon Nimmo gets hurt. What are you going to do out there? Well, Starling Marte can be your center fielder, obviously. He might just be your starting center fielder anyway. Mark Canha can be in right field. And there you go. Jeff McNeil might have to slide to the left, and you have Robinson Cano. You have some coverage. If Eduardo Escobar goes down and you need a third baseman, Jeff McNeil can slide over to third. Cano can play second. You can switch those guys around depending on how you want to align it, but you have coverage. He is such a vital piece to this roster right now. Billy Epler has talked about liking guys that can play in the dirt and in the grass, guys that can play the outfield and the infield. Who else on this roster really fits that criteria? You got JD Davis, but that's not quality defense anywhere you put him. You got Dominic Smith, but that's limited versatility because it's left field and first base and not great defense in left. There's just not a lot of options that can get moved around, that can play all over the place. Jeff McNeil's that guy for this Mets team. And that's really important when you're going through the grind of a season. So his function on this roster is hard to replicate. Sure, you could trade Jeff McNeil inside Jonathan Villar, and yeah, Jonathan Villar can technically play in the outfield, but if you just look at the defensive metrics, I mean, Jeff McNeil is a better defensive player at nearly every position than Jonathan Villar is. Jonathan Villar has not played the outfield in some time. Jeff McNeil has been out there, was out there last season, and graded out well. So that defensive versatility is something that's really hard to replace. And yes, you could say, all right, you're going to trade Jeff McNeil and sign Kris Bryant, but that's a downgrade offensively. Now it's a big boost offensively as far as the ceiling of the upside and the power profile that Bryant would bring. But when Jeff McNeil is right, a 143 WRC plus in 2019, it's a really good player. So, and even honestly, I'd argue his value in 2019 makes me think that the next 3 years of Jeff McNeil could be comparable to the next 3 years of Kris Bryant. It could be. Because Kris Bryant, as great as he has been, he did tail off with the Giants down the stretch in the second half. And I'm not entirely sure how he's going to age. And it's not just about their value to the team and what they put out there when you're playing the games. It's also based on the contract. How much surplus value can Kris Bryant provide at $25 million or whatever he's going to get paid compared to Jeff McNeil? It's going to be making a fraction of that through arbitration. So I look at Jeff McNeil right now, and even if you want to sign a Kris Bryant, I don't know why you wouldn't want to keep Jeff McNeil, because there is still starters on the market that the Mets can sign. And I know there is this concern about the starting rotation and building on depth, but I look at their rotation right now, and you have Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom, which is obviously the best 1-2 punch in baseball. You have Carlos Carrasco, who I know fans are down on, but I still think has a lot of upside based on his career numbers, not just a couple of months in a season where he blew out his hammy in spring training, came back, got rushed through his rehab process, tried to save the season for the Mets. Didn't work out for him, but I think he's going to have a bounce back year. You have Taijuan Walker, who showed a lot in the first half and not a lot in the second half, but I still think he can still be a quality 4th or 5th starter for you. You have Tyler McGill, who showed flashes. You have David Peterson, who was good in his rookie season, bad in his sophomore season. You have Jordan Yamamoto for depth, and you have Trevor Williams, who I also liked in a Mets uniform and think as someone who could pitch out of the bullpen and the rotation, he brings some value. Do you want to add another starting pitcher to the mix? Yeah. But can you also go out and get Carlos Rodon? Sure, you can. You can sign him, and there you go. You don't have to give up anything. You keep your lineup exactly how it is. Sign Rodon and Bryant if you want to, if you really want to go all in, and you can hang on to Jeff McNeil. The only question to me is how much value are you going to get in return for Jeff McNeil? And then the other question is, what are you trying to trade for? You're trading for starting pitching help, if that's the goal here. But if he doesn't get you that starter himself, what do you have to trade on top of McNeil to get that starter? And then you just create another hole in your roster. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. It, until I see the trade, I just don't know where Jeff McNeil getting moved is the best thing for the Mets, unless it really is untenable to keep him on the roster. I mean, that's the thing. If that locker room chemistry issue is that great and you have to move him, then try to get the best return you can. But I would even be more comfortable trading Jeff McNeil for a prospect package and getting as much as possible than having to trade Jeff McNeil plus stuff to acquire a pitcher when you can maybe just sign a pitcher in free agency that can fill a need. Even if you were to sign a Zach Greinke, and maybe that's an episode I'll be doing later on this week, but someone who can just eat innings for you, and maybe they're not going to be an ace. Zach Greinke's best days are behind him. But if he's going to go out and give you a 4 ERA and pitch 180 innings when you already have frontline guys in your rotation, that could be all you need. So I look at where the Mets are, and it just doesn't make sense for me to trade Jeff McNeil unless you're definitely going to get Kris Bryant or Trevor Story. So let's actually discuss that now too, right? Because Pat Ragazzo in that article, which again, you can find in the description of this episode, I'll put that in there. He mentions Trevor Story and Kris Bryant and how these are players the Mets could be interested in. They're still the top bats on the market along with Carlos Correa, but no one really believes that Correa is going to sign with the Mets. He probably still wants to be a shortstop. The Mets aren't going to give another decade-long contract. That's unlikely. So if it is a Kris Bryant or a Trevor Story the Mets have their eyes on, and Steve Cohen has already made it clear to Billy Epler, hey, let's get one of those guys. Let's spend the money. I want another frontline star talent added to this team, to this lineup. Then you can kind of start to get around the idea that maybe trading Jeff McNeil makes sense. But my question then becomes, what's the contract for those players? And look, I have spent so much of this offseason talking down the possibility of a Kris Bryant sign. Not that I don't think it's possible, because I certainly can see Steve Cohen looking at Kris Bryant, a former MVP, similar to Max Scherzer with his Cy Young hardware, and saying, look, I want that. I want that toy that's out there on the market. Mine, give it to me. I can see that happening. That's now I've been talking this down. I've been talking down the notion of a Kris Bryant signing because I think that over a long-term deal, I have a ton of concerns about how that contract will age. Will it be great for the first 2 years? Probably. And maybe that's all that matters. But you would hate for Kris Bryant in 3 years to put you out of the market for Juan Soto, for example, or another player like that. That's where you get into this question. And because the defense was so bad this year, again, if you go to outs above average in the percentile rankings, he was among the worst defenders in the league, in the first percentile, however you say that. I struggle with, how do you frame that? The first, you look at the page, it says 1. Okay, it can go from 0 to 100. He's 1. That's as low as it gets, right? So you look at his defense, and you say he has versatility, but in 2 years, is he still running down fly balls in the outfield? That versatility dissipates. And he's a bad defensive third baseman already. Is he just a DH that you have for 7 years when you could have a Mark Vientos as a cheap, cost-controlled DH for 7 years if you wanted to? That's my concern there. So if we're going to get into a Kris Bryant, Trevor Story podcast, which I'll be honest, I might do this week as well, I'd be more interested on Trevor Story. All right. If you told me the Mets are going to sign Trevor Story because he wants a short deal to rebuild his value on a contender, and you can get Trevor Story on a 3-year deal with an opt-out after the first year, and it's a balloon contract on that first year, and he wants to reset his value, and he has been, since 2018, the second best shortstop in baseball outside of Francisco Lindor. I think from 2018 through 2020, that is, because 2021, he did have the best season. I think Bogarts is ahead of him now at this point from 2018 to 2021. I don't have those numbers in front of me, so don't quote me on that. But I do know from 2018 through 2020, Trevor Story was the second best shortstop in baseball, according to F4, the best shortstop being Francisco Lindor. So if you're going to tell me the Mets are going to pair Lindor and Story up the middle, shortstop second base with Escobar at third, and that's in the cards, and you can trade Jeff McNeil to get starting pitching, and you know you have a deal lined up where Jeff McNeil plus can get you a starter like Luis Castillo, like now we're talking. But that is so many different things that have to happen to make me comfortable moving Jeff McNeil. And if it's not for a starting pitcher of the caliber of Luis Castillo, or if it costs McNeil and a top prospect to get him, I think I'd be more comfortable just seeing the Mets go out and sign one of these stars that are on the market and continue to stick with the plan of building through free agency, get Jeff McNeil on the phone, figure out who he's offended, mend those fences, and move forward, because I still believe the Mets' best chance to win in 2022, it is with a bounce back season from Jeff McNeil, because I look at all of the Mets players who had down years who are returning. If you're talking about Dominic Smith, you're talking about Jeff McNeil, JD Davis, all these different players that you're wondering what you're going to get from them next season. You're just not sure if you're going to get the best version of them. Jeff McNeil is clearly the best bounce back candidate. And with his salary, with his versatility, his function on this roster is very hard to replace. So I would be very cautious to move him unless A, you know you're going to get one of these top tier bats in free agency, and B, it's just completely untenable to have him return. It's the only way it makes sense to me. We'll see what the Mets do. This will obviously not be solved until after the lockout, but it was an interesting report by Pat Ragazzo. I'm curious what will happen here. I hope that Jeff McNeil is still a Met in 2022. What can I say? Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. On tomorrow's show, let's do it, right? Let's do the Trevor Story, Kris Bryant podcast. I'll compare the numbers. I'll make the case for signing Trevor Story. It'll more be a Trevor Story podcast than a Kris Bryant podcast. I got to let this guy at the hook. I got to stop ripping into him. But as always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicap expert Lee Sterling. They have been on a crazy hot streak recently, so you can find all your daily gambling needs there. You can subscribe to Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.